Good morning, class. Today, the class covers Chapter 12 of the textbook. The topic is International Trade Theory and Development Strategy. The chapter emphasized that the answers will not be the same for all countries given the great diversity that exists among developing countries. No unique solution can be recommended as regards the role of international trade in promoting economic development. It is essential to develop the assumptions and conclusions of neoclassical trade theory, as well as the nature of the criticisms offered in the text, in some detail. It is useful to emphasize that this is one of the most controversial issues in development economics. A distinction between the logic of the arguments and their empirical relevance should be made. This may take several lectures, depending on the background of the students. The following video lecture discusses the problems of developing countries and explains arguments against free foreign trade from the perspective of developing countries.
Let us start a new topic, international trade and economic development. And all of us know there are more than 200 countries in the world, and these countries could be divided into different parts. High-income countries, which are rich, middle-income countries, and then low-income countries. And low-income countries can be considered poor or not as developed. Now, these poor or low-income countries would like to raise the standard of living of their people or increase average income per person, or what we refer to as economic development. Now when we have the world divided like this in terms of income, we know the world will not be a level playing field for different participants. And in this real world situation, what is the role of international trade, particularly as it relates to economic development of poor countries? And this is what we examine in this and subsequent lecture video. To understand the link between international trade and economic development, let us see how the world emerged in the 20th century. If you look at the initial part of the 20th century, say starting from early part of 20th century to about the onset of World War II in 1939, the world could be divided into two parts, one independent nations and two colonies of European nations. Now, as far as independent nations go, these could be further subclassified based on the ideology that they were pursuing. One were a set of countries which are based on market economies, and these countries were like US, UK, and so on. And then in 1917, the former Soviet Union became a socialist or a communist country. So this was the picture, say, leading up to World War II. At the end of World War II, the world could be divided into three parts, one being the Western industrialized nations like the US, UK, and so on. Then we had a set of countries which followed the socialist or the communist principles, and they were a group of Soviet nations like Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, and also China. And the third group was essentially the former colonies of European nations, they became independent nations. And when they became independent nations, these countries were extremely poor. And since they wanted to develop, they were called developing countries. Now, these developing countries, around the time they became independent, there were a very large number of them and spread over the continents of Africa, Asia, and other continents. And so most of the world population resided in these developing countries. And the key characteristics of these developing countries around the time they became independent are as follows. Number one, these countries were extremely poor based on their average income per person, which was extremely low. These countries had dominance or preponderance of agriculture and mining, what they didn't have is an industrial base. Either it was too small or just did not exist. If you look at other indicators such as the ones relating to health, education, infrastructure, etc., they were at the lowest level. So if you look at the living facilities, they were really very basic, and these countries exported agriculture or natural-based products and imported machine-based consumer products. So these are the key characteristics of developing countries, or this is how they looked like at the time they became independent. As one would expect, the main goal of these developing countries was to lift the standard of living of their population, and this they wanted to achieve rather quickly. Now, if you want standard of living to go up, what you require is, number one, all resources must be employed, and number two, if you want average income per person to increase, there must be increases in productivity, because it's just productivity which can lead to higher and higher income. And around that time, economists agreed that industrialization is the key to economic development, or uplifting the masses or lifting the standard of living of people living in these countries. Now, industrialization can be used to produce consumer items and also produce machines like tractors, harvesters, and so on to increase farm productivity, help build infrastructure, which again is very important, and these countries lack, like build paved roads, railways, airports, electricity generation, water supply, particularly for irrigation, and so on. And thus, if industrialization took place in these countries, they knew that productivity would increase, and so would the average income per person. Now, for industrialization to take place, because these countries had no industrial base, they had to import machinery from other countries. They could be either Western industrialized nations or could be the socialist countries like the Soviet Union and so on. Now, to industrialize, they could follow one of the two models. One is the free market system as it existed in the US and Western Europe, or another possibility was to look at the examples of the socialist countries where economic development was directed by the government in Soviet Union and so on. One thing to note about these two alternatives to choose from, free market versus government-directed economic development, is the following. For the US and Western Europe to become significant economic power, say what they were at the conclusion of World War II, it took them about 2 centuries to become what they became. And if you look at the Soviet Union, they started their experiment in 1917, and by the end of World War II, Soviet Union had become a superpower, economically industrialized country. So So the key thing here is industrialization was accepted as the key to economic development, and these developing countries had two models to choose from. We know that developing countries could increase standard of living of its people by industrialization, which would increase productivity, and this would lead to an increase in average income per person. Now, what would be a role of foreign trade in economic development of these poor countries? And generally speaking, the dominant view was that free foreign trade may be harmful or hurtful to the interest of developing countries. So let us look at the reasons as to why people believe this. Number one, we know that theory of comparative advantage, whether it is by Ricardo or by Heckscher-Ohlin, what it states is each country should produce and export the product in which it has comparative advantage and import the product in which it has comparative disadvantage. Based on what we know about the condition of developing countries and also the theory of comparative advantage, we know that this theory would recommend that developing countries should export food and raw materials and import machines or machine-based products. Now, so this is what the theory of comparative advantage will tell us, and according to theory of comparative advantage, the world becomes better off. But what we realize is this may not help the objectives of developing countries. Why? Because to increase standard of living of their people, they want to industrialize. So there are three problems with the application of theory of comparative advantage. What are these three problems? Number one, how will these countries industrialize? Because they know that industrialization is the key to economic development. Number two, when you are exporting food and raw materials, we should remember that demand for these products may not increase much. Why? Because these goods are considered for most part to be necessities, and the demand for necessities does not go up by a whole lot when incomes increase. So if you are looking at medium to long-term phenomena, the demand for these products out of developing countries may not increase by much. Then the third argument against this is based on a hypothesis put forth by an economist by the name of Raoul Prebisch. And what he found through his research is developing countries face a secular decline in terms of trade. Now, terms of trade simply is a ratio of price of exports divided by price of imports. And what he found through his empirical work is that price of these products, export products like food and raw material, may not increase as fast as the price of imports of manufacturers. So if you are looking at ways to increase export earnings of developing countries, chances are they may not increase, or if they increase, they'll not increase by as much. And at the same time, in these developing countries, there's a huge demand for imports of machines and so on. So this belief or using theory of comparative advantage to the needs and objectives of developing countries would have been inappropriate according to the set of thinkers. Number two, if for some reason these developing countries are able to establish industries, and when they initially establish industries, these industries could be called infants or not as mature as industries in Western industrialized countries. And the reason for this is as follows. The longer you stay in the market and produce goods, you become more and more efficient. And part of the reason for this is through economies of scale. And so if a mature firm is competing against a firm which is just a baby or an infant, the infant cannot stand against the efficient production of a more mature industry. So if we have free foreign trade, chances are these infant industries will be wiped out by foreign competition. In fact, this is an argument which was advocated initially by Alexander Hamilton in the 18th century and then refined by Frederick List in 1841 or middle of the 19th century. So when you are trying to industrialize initially, you need protection from foreign competition, or we cannot have free foreign trade. Lastly, these developing countries became colonies because of foreign investments and so on. So these countries were very afraid of anything foreign, including foreign trade, foreign investments, and even foreign help through foreign trade. So these were the arguments which were advocated by economists, and this seemed to be the dominant feeling in terms of the role of foreign trade in aiding economic development for these set of developing countries.
For more now, joining me here in Washington is Dan Ikenson. He is the director of the Cato Institute's Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, and he's an expert in U.S.-China trade. Also joining us from London is Victor Gao. He is the director of the China National Association of International Studies. And with me here in Washington is Yoshikazu Kato. He's an expert in Japan-China relations, and he's lectured in Japan, China, and the United States. Also with us in studio is Mark Weisbrot. He is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Welcome to all of you to the show. Dan, let me start with you. The U.S. has been pushing this deal for a number of years now. Put it in some kind of perspective for us. How significant is this?
Well, I think it's significant in the sense that the costs of failure would have exceeded the benefits of success. So it's a good thing that we've avoided a breakdown in these talks. What's important about this is that the multilateral trade liberalization path that has been used for since 1947 has broken down. We had 8 successful rounds of multilateral trade liberalization under the GATT, and the Doha round was launched in 2001, and it failed to produce any fruit. And there was uncertainty about how to lead global trade liberalization forward. I think the TPP is the vehicle for doing this. There are 12 countries that have signed onto this. The countries account for 40% of global output, a third of global trade. And what it's doing, it's creating an incentive for other countries in the region to engage in reforms so that they can qualify to join. And I think this is probably the way to get to multilateral trade liberalization.
Victor, China is not part of this deal. What's the view from China on the TPP?
Well, first of all, China is the largest trading nation in the world, and China has signed up free trade agreements with ASEAN, all the 10 countries, as well as with Australia and New Zealand. And China, as a matter of fact, would support any real effort at promoting free trade in the world, whether it is within the WTO framework or, in this particular case, within the TPP framework. If TPP turns out to be a real, genuine effort at promoting free trade, China will welcome it and will deal with it as it is. However, on the other hand, if TPP eventually turns out to be a protective free trade agreement, rather than truly an open-ended, inclusive free trade arrangement, then China would also need to deal with it as it is. I hope TPP will turn out to be a truly open-ended free trade arrangement. That will really stimulate greater trade in the Asian Pacific world, and I think China, as the biggest trading nation and as the largest trading partner for more than 125 nations in the world, will welcome TPP if it is truly aimed at liberating more trade.
Yoshikazu, what are the benefits for Japan?
I think first of all, this is a diplomatic achievement for Japanese leadership in the region, Asia Pacific. It is very good, but probably this is diplomatic success and political achievement. But a lot of uncertainties will be remaining because Japanese market, Japanese society, a lot of people say looks conservative. not enough opening up. But probably it is really good for, stimulating the Japanese conservative markets, for example, agriculture, medicine, or, some, and so on. So I think it's really good for opening up our own market. But, I am from a small town in Japan, and actually a lot of people, farmers, are now upset, more than nervous, because now they have to face into, more competition with cheaper products from the outside. So I think now for the Japanese leadership, how to convince these conservative people, this would be really reflecting on the future negotiation with the United States and other 11 nations. So I think this is good. And it could be said it's a kind of diplomatic achievement, but a couple of uncertainties will be remaining. So it's we are facing some dilemma. But as a whole, this is a really positive and very healthy things for future prosperity and stability in the Asia Pacific.
Right, and the thing we should remember is that this deal has to be approved by all the member states.
Exactly.
Mark, there has been opposition to this deal, not just in the United States, in other countries as well. People see it as a sellout to big business. I mean, we have union leaders, rights groups, environmentalists. They're all speaking out, saying that this is going to hurt consumers, it's going to cost jobs.
Yes, well, I think this is a very different debate than we had 20 years ago over NAFTA. I think this time the public interest groups won the debate, even though they didn't win the vote in Congress, because the most powerful lobbies in this country were for this agreement. So, but the debate was very different, and you had Nobel Prize winning economists also against the agreement, which you didn't have and you didn't have that the last time. And why is that? Because here I think people realize, the people who are paying attention to this at least, they realize, first of all, that it's not really primarily a trade agreement, and certainly not a free trade agreement. The most important aspects of it are really protectionist, strengthening and lengthening patent and copyright protection. We have in the United States a drug for hepatitis C, Sovaldi, which costs $84,000 for a 3-month treatment. There's a $1,000 generic version sold in India. These companies are trying, from what we know about the agreement, this is about giving them more power, giving corporations the right to sue governments under the investor-to-state dispute resolution mechanism. So these are things that are really just a big corporate power grab, and that's how they're seen here, and also in many of the other countries that are looking at, because the poorer countries, of course, can afford to pay these monopoly prices even less than we can in the United States.
Dan, is this a big corporate power grab? And one other thing, why have all these negotiations been conducted in private, in secret?
I think too much has been made about this secrecy aspect. All trade negotiations occur behind closed doors, but before a vote occurs in any country, the text is made available to the public and a robust debate ensues. I don't disagree with Mark about some of the protectionist aspects. I believe in free trade. The TPP is not free trade. It's a managed trade agreement. There is protectionism that's going to be baked into it. I share Mark's concerns about lengthy patents and copyright protections. The investor-state dispute settlement system does give certain advantages to corporations, to foreign corporations, that they don't deserve. And it upsets the balance and circumvents domestic legislative processes and regulatory processes. And we have baked-in protectionism where the auto industry is concerned. We have a 2.5% tariff on autos in the United States, and the U.S. industry secured a 25-year phase-out period for that 2.5%. So there's no real liberalization there. We also have these very protectionist rules of origin with respect to clothing. We're going to be expecting to import a lot more clothing from Vietnam, but Vietnam's exporters won't get preferential access to the U.S. market unless they use U.S. inputs. So the bottom line, though, is that I think there will be a lot of liberalization in this agreement, despite these exceptions that I just identified. We want to evaluate this. There's 30 chapters. We're going to evaluate each one and rate each chapter. And I have the feeling that we're going to find it to be net liberalizing, in which case I think we can support it.
Victor, how much does politics play into what is going on right now? Is the TPP a counter to China's economic strength?
Well, philosophically, China as, the second largest economy in the world, if we use the official exchange rate measurement, or the largest economy in the world, if we use purchasing power parity to measure the Chinese economy, is not some economy which can be contained. On the contrary, I would say that China is a champion of free trade, and China is very eager to embrace any free trade agreement if it is truly a free trade agreement. For TPP, it's the same case. But as the other panelists just now mentioned, we need to wait and read all the texts. And we also need to, see through the real debate which may happen in many of the 12 member states and see what exactly this TPP is all about. As I mentioned, if it is a protective free trade agreement, it will not be sustainable, and people will rise up against it one way or another, and the implementation of TPP in the years to come may also, be generating a lot of controversy. If it is truly aimed at free trade, then we all need to jump up and embrace it. And China may be eager to, try to apply for membership. So I think in China, it's a very hot topic. We are talking about it, but until we know what TPP truly is, we still do not know what position China will fundamentally take. And we need to see more to come in the coming weeks and months.
Yoshikazu, you mentioned the concerns expressed by Japanese farmers over this deal. I mean, are there any other groups of people in Japan who are opposed to this? Because in the United States, for instance, there are groups that say that this will cost jobs in the U.S. In effect, jobs will be exported to countries where labor costs are a lot lower. Is that a concern in Japan?
I think so. Rice, automobile. They are really concerned about this negotiation. But now I think Shinzo Abe, our prime minister, put a huge political capital on this agreement. Actually this time TPP's Minister Amari, actually he connected with Shinzo Abe hotline and in a report on the time and what's going on, and it means a lot for future Japanese diplomacy, even future Japanese direction in Asia Pacific. So I think this would be regarded with the Japanese grand strategy in this region. So at this time, a lot of opposition party, a lot of farmers, they are upset. They don't know what's going to happen in the next. But as a whole, I think now the atmosphere in Japan, this is indispensable. This would be inevitable road we need to catch up with. So, and in terms of dealing with China, because Japan, we are the neighbor of China. Probably, Japan and China, we mutually welcome. Actually, the TPP, it's a good thing. It's promoting the regional trade and commerce. So this is good. And actually, we welcome the Chinese future post-commitment and contribution to this framework. So of course, uncertainties in TPP's agreement in the next, but probably in terms of dealing with China, probably Japanese government, we will continue to focus on manage this free agreement in terms of how to communicate with the rest of China. So right. It means a lot for future of Japan.
Mark, what about Latin America? Several Latin American countries part of this deal. How would it impact them, especially Mexico?
Well, Mexico already has NAFTA with us, so I don't know how it actually could impact them in the sense that they would face, some greater competition. But again, I don't think we're talking about a free trade agreement at all. Not only the protectionism of the pharmaceuticals and the things that we agree upon that are bad and really hurt consumers, but the giving the corporations the right to sue governments directly, which they don't have in the WTO, and for anything that infringes upon their profits. So this is a threat to financial regulation, as the Canadian finance minister acknowledged soon after President Obama denounced Elizabeth Warren for raising that issue. He said that NAFTA was a threat to the Volcker rule here in the United States. It's a threat to public health and safety regulation, to environmental regulation. And we know this because we have experience with these lawsuits for 20 years since NAFTA, and of course in other agreements. So this is really, again, when I say it's a corporate power grab, that isn't just rhetoric. This is the whole purpose of these agreements is to shift power away from the public, from elected institutions, from even the judicial systems of the countries that are signing the agreement,